Hey everyone, it's Dwayne Monroe, one of the hosts of the Film Conversations podcast. In today's episode, we speak with Dr. Robert Beshara, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Humanities at Northern New Mexico College. He is also the founder of criticalpsychology.org and a musician, as well as a composer. In fact, the music you hear in the background is Istima from Robert's excellent album, Horny Cricket. The link is in the show notes, and I probably mispronounced that Arabic word. For more information about Dr. Beshara's work, please visit robertbeshara.com. Today's movie is The Killing, directed by Stanley Kubrick and released in 1956, and I will now read the Wikipedia synopsis for you. The Killing is a 1956 American film noir directed by Stanley Kubrick and produced by James B. Harris. It was written by Kubrick and Jim Thompson and based on Lionel White's novel Clean Break. It stars Sterling Hayden, Coleen Gray, and Vince Edwards, and features Marie Windsor, Elisha Cook Jr., J.C. Flippen and Timothy Carey. Johnny Clay is a veteran criminal planning one last heist before settling down and marrying Faye. He plans to steal $2 million from the money counting room of a racetrack during a featured race. Johnny assembles a team consisting of a corrupt cop, a betting widow teller to gain access to the backroom, a sharpshooter to shoot the favorite horse during the race to distract the crowd and keep the winnings from being paid out, a wrestler to provide another distraction by provoking a fight at the track bar, and a track bartender. It's a fantastic film, and Robert is an insightful and fun person to talk to, so I hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, how's everyone doing today?
Good.
It's a sunny day.
Yeah, it's a bit cloudy here in Amsterdam, but then again, it is indeed the Netherlands. So as listeners heard in the intro, we have with us today the inestimable Dr. Robert Beshara, and Robert chose our movie today, The Killing, which is a Kubrick film from 1956. And I'd like to start by giving Robert the floor and saying, Robert, why did you choose this film, and how does it speak to you, and anything else that actually occurs to you about this film?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good opportunity to highlight one of the lesser known films by Kubrick, right? So I have a couple of anecdotes to share before we get started. The first one is more than 20 years ago, or around 20 years ago, like the first book that I read, because I wanted to read it, not because it was assigned in school or something like that, was a book on Kubrick. So I remember this quite well, that I went to the library and chose a book on Kubrick and read the whole thing and kind of pushed myself to finish it. And that's when I actually started learning about some of the other lesser known works. Now, the context of that is I was in Egypt at the time, because it's where I'm from, where I grew up, and it was hard to find these films. And so the second anecdote is that there was this Egyptian filmmaker called Mohammed Khan. He's quite well known in the Arab world. And he passed away, but he was a friend of the family, and we were quite close. And he had an extensive film collection back then, of course, on VHS tapes.
Yes.
And he actually was so obsessive with how he archived his films that he had, like a sheet with all the films, and they had numbers and everything. So you could actually borrow films from him, and he would track who has what and all of that. So I borrowed a bunch of films from him, including Killer's Kiss, which is a 1955 film by Kubrick, released the year before The Killing, and then of course The Killing. So I got to see them, luckily, that way. This is way before you could watch stuff online. In Egypt, definitely it was so hard to find these films. So the fact that he had VHS tapes of them and I was able to get a hold of them, it was quite a privilege. So I wanted to kind of preface our conversation by sharing that piece of information. Now, the reason why I picked this film, as I mentioned, I think of it as Kubrick's first mature film. It's not his most famous film, obviously, but it's his most mature in the sense, his first mature film in the sense that his two previous attempts at feature films, Fear and Desire, Killer's Kiss, are kind of like student films. And this is the first time that he works with a fairly large budget of $320,000, and you start seeing some of the aesthetic elements and stylistic elements that you can see throughout his career from that moment, the inception of that. So that's one aspect. And then, of course, the nonlinear narrative structure, something that really appealed to me, particularly because, for my generation, Pulp Fiction represented the epitome of a nonlinear film. And then here I am, I was exposed to a film from 1956 that did the same thing, and it's not as famous as Pulp Fiction. So that really, I was curious about that. So I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, that's a fantastic memory to share, actually. Thank you for that. And I'm impressed by the organization and the passion. And isn't it interesting when those two things come together? When someone has a passion for a topic, but also, they organize it in such a way that they can share it with others in a way that also protects, what they've invested their time in. I love that. Because I, as a child, I also benefited from someone who had curated the work of Buckminster Fuller in that manner, and I have fond memories of that. So the film itself, the structure of the film, would you mind talking about what it is about the film as a film that speaks to you? Because speaking just for myself, when I first watched it, what I was struck by was, and particularly as someone who, as we all are today, sort of confronted with the just the sloppiness of the Netflix era of filmmaking, just the efficiency of the filmmaking is what about film, the best films of that era is what always grabs me. It's like the cinematography, the screenwriting, just the whole entire thing. The fact that you feel as if these people are not playing, so to speak.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we can say that it has a lot of the elements of film noir. The anti-hero protagonist, Johnny Clay, the femme fatale, Sherry Petey, the high contrast mise en scène, the elaborate heist, all of these things. But at the same time, Kubrick was a master of many genres. He could make a comedy, like Doctor Strangelove. He can also make a horror, like The Shining. He can make a war movie, like Full Metal Jacket. And so that's something that's also curious about him, is that he didn't stick to a genre, but rather experimented with different genres and tried to, at the same time, master the genre, but also capture his unique style. So one of the unique aspects, I think, maybe one of the themes I can talk about today, is frequent collaborations with certain producers or actors that he brought multiple times. And he was attracted usually to kind of quirky individuals. So as you mentioned earlier, you talked about Sterling Hayden, and he's definitely, he plays the anti-hero Johnny Clay, and he's an enigma for me for a number of reasons. Obviously, he's famous for his role in Kubrick's Doctor Strangelove as Jack D. Ripper. Interesting character name. Great performance. So just to give some information to the listeners, he was a captain in World War II. Who fought alongside Yugoslav partisans against fascists in Croatia. That experience led him to join the Communist Party in 1946. And then he ended up backstabbing his comrades in 1951 when he testified in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. He has a very strange career because he started early in his career as a star in The Asphalt Jungle, Johnny Guitar, and The Killing, and then his career declined since the mid-60s with the exception of a small role in The Godfather, right? So when I was watching an interview with him yesterday in preparation for this conversation, and he talked about how he got into acting mostly so he can fund his passion for sailing, which is quite curious. Like all the money that he made from acting, he just used to buy boats, and that was like his obsession. So very, very strange character. So you can see the frequent collaboration aspect. Like Kubrick is attracted to this quirky person, and also brings him in multiple projects. I see the same thing with Timothy Carey, the actor that portrays Nicky Arcane in The Killing. He also appears in Kubrick's follow-up movie Paths of Glory. I don't know if you know much about Timothy Carey, but I'm kind of a little bit obsessed with this.
I don't. I can't speak for others, but I besides the face.
Does anyone else know a bit about him? Out of curiosity.
I was going to say, not me, unfortunately.
Okay. So he is considered. So Timothy Carey, he has a small role, but he's memorable in the film, right? He's the one that shoots the horse, right? Kills the horse. And so he is considered one of the early cult figures of underground cinema. And again, his style of acting, there's a sense of expressionism to it, a sense of madness, probably his own madness in real life, which Kubrick was attracted to that.
Interesting.
Again, you see this pattern with Malcolm McDowell's Alex in Clockwork Orange, Jack Nicholson's Jack Torrance in The Shining, Vincent D'Onofrio's Private Pile in Full Metal Jacket, etc. So with Timothy Carey, his acting style prefigures a lot of the expressionistic approaches of Nicolas Cage, John Turturro, especially in The Big Lebowski, Vincent Gallo. And he wrote and directed a wacky independent film in '62 titled The World's Greatest Sinner, which I love the fact that it's scored by Frank Zappa, one of my favorite composers. So it's just, the fact that this person is there in that film adds a little bit of strangeness to the movie. And again, Kubrick collaborated with him multiple times. Now in the film, Nicky Arcane uses the N-word in a racially tense scene, if you all remember, with a black track parking attendant. Interestingly, I looked up this actor a little bit to read more about his background. And so his name is James Edwards, and he is considered one of the first black actors in Hollywood to represent black characters in a humanizing way, years before Sidney Poitier. So again,
I know him from a Douglas Sirk movie.
So that's interesting too.
Yeah, that one was in the 50s or maybe early 60s. Anyway, I remember his face very well from a movie I saw when I was a child. And I forgot to mention earlier, I know Tim Carey from Columbo. And he has just an amazing face, and the way he sort of bares his teeth, when he speaks, it's just I'm fascinated by him as well.
I wanted to say something about that scene. Charlie and I were talking about this earlier. And he mentioned how it took him aback at that moment when Carey's character uses the N-word. And a mature viewer understands why he did it. Like it wasn't merely a racist outburst. It was because he was trying to disengage, as quickly as possible, and he figured how he would do that. But it was the engagement. And just for those in the audience who don't know what we're talking about, there's a moment when Carey's character, who's a sharpshooter, whose part of this overall elaborate plan is to snipe the horse to create confusion and also to prevent the money from being paid out. And he has to get to a position to be able to do this. But the area is behind a barrier that is controlled by a guard. And the guard is this African-American person. And Carey's character interacts with him as a human because they're both veterans of World War II. This is what we're given to understand. And the black guard, responds to this being treated like a human being by wanting to just talk more with this person who is treating him like a human being and not like an other. And this reminds me of a story that my grandfather, who served in the 5th Armored Division in the war, told me about a time when he returned from the war, and and it was like 1947 or so, and he goes to a diner, and things go wrong because people don't want him to be in this diner, and he, having spent over a year of his life killing fascists, was not in a mood to be, compliant. In any event, a cop arrives at this diner and interacts with my grandfather and tells him, "Listen, I know this is BS. What's happening here, and I have to, take you out of this diner." But they're both veterans, and this is why. And they talk about what areas of the European theater they served in and so forth. And it was that layer, even kind of creating a bridge between, kind of pierce for a moment at least, the racist ideology that, well, yes, he's black or whatever. However, we both were in the shit, and therefore I'm going to treat him, with some measure of respect and get him out of the situation with these people. When I saw that scene in the movie, that's what I thought of. I thought of that story that my grandfather told me, and so I immediately understood kind of the subtext of that particular moment.
And you don't see that many scenes around that era of sort of humanizing scenes like that. So that's quite unique, and I think in many ways ahead of its time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's another movie I just thought of. Have you ever seen Odds Against Tomorrow?
I haven't seen it.
It's a crime movie with Harry Belafonte and Robert Ryan and Ed Begley. It's about a bank robbery, and Robert Ryan is just racist through and through. So there's a lot of interaction between him and Harry Belafonte, and Harry Belafonte acts in the way you're talking about, like a human being.
Yes,
it's a good movie.
Yeah,
I'll check it out.
Quite good movie. Yeah.
I think it's probably, and I want to hear from everyone as well, but probably it's good to kind of give some background on Kubrick. I mean, this is his first mature film. As I mentioned, he made like 2, we can say, amateur films before that. His background before that, he's a photographer. He worked for Look magazine, so he really mastered the art form of, visual composition, and you can see that throughout his work afterwards in terms of like every shot, the lighting, the mise en scène, all of those elements. And of course, he was known to be a master chess player too. And that's something that also is a theme throughout his work, especially in Paths of Glory, the way he approaches war as kind of a game of chess, but also his mastery of genres, his mastery of... he played a lot of mind games with the people he worked with. And so he wasn't the nicest person in the world, it has to be said, because, there's a famous story of Malcolm McDowell. He was like, they were best friends during A Clockwork Orange, and then as soon as the film was done, he never answered the phone. Kubrick never answered the phone. So it's like he uses people to get, he breaks down the actor. He's known to have actors do like 100 takes until they have, a nervous breakdown and they stop acting, but they're actually, you see them in a state of anxiety. You see this in The Shining quite well, but you also see it in Eyes Wide Shut with Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise. And so he pushes the limit. He plays psychological games. He pushed Peter Sellers so much in Doctor Strangelove because he was supposed to play Major Kong as well. But Peter Sellers was so exhausted from playing so many characters that he actually ended up injuring himself so he wouldn't play Major Kong. Like that's how much he pushes people.
I saw in preparation for this, I saw an interview with Harvey Keitel, and apparently Harvey Keitel was supposed to play the doctor, not the doctor, but in
Eyes Wide Shut.
Eyes Wide Shut. The Sidney Pollack character.
Right.
Harvey Keitel had that, but the story goes, I've heard a couple of versions, but basically Keitel just quit. He walked off. Wow. One story is that it was just multiple takes of him walking through a door, not even saying anything. And so the 2 different versions, one is Harvey Keitel says, "Fuck this, you're crazy." and just walks off. And the other one is that Harvey Keitel just says, I didn't want to be disrespected.
Interesting.
And so, so I quit.
Interesting.
And, yeah.
So,
I've heard interviews with Kidman and Cruise, about their experience on Eyes Wide Shut. And Kidman's statements are the more coherent of the two, which probably shouldn't surprise anybody. But what she talked about being pushed quite a bit, and they were married at the time, as I recall. Cruise and Kidman were married at the time,
Yes,
so that was another aspect
after
of
the
this.
film.
Yeah, and that Kubrick was playing, deliberately playing on, the natural tensions in an intimate relationship.
Absolutely.
And of course, he walks away from the wreckage.
But he was a perfectionist, and in a sense, this is like kind of the unhuman side of him, is that he's a master chess player. He knows the perfect film in his head, and he's going to do whatever it takes to get there. And it doesn't matter if he breaks down people, and they reach madness. Right.
Yeah.
I saw another interview, and this was with Kubrick himself, and he talked about his days as a photographer and how much he learned, and he described it as learning how to solve problems. And he kind of went on and on about that. If you learn how to solve problems, then you can get a lot done. And then we're talking about how he thought of people he was working with. He went on to say, when you find people that don't know how to solve problems, then that's a problem itself. So because they don't know how to think things through. So he was obviously very certain of what he wanted. I think that might be why he used the same people over and over.
It's a very interesting way of thinking, and I can, as a technologist and as a person who's had to do things in multinational environments, one of the ethoses, or that's not even a word, but one of the working assumptions is that those of us who come together to do these things, like deploy massive systems, we are people who get things done, and we know how to solve problems. In fact, being able to solve problems, because problems are inevitable with computational systems, being able to solve problems is part of the job description, not in having all the answers, but being able to identify what the problem is. And it could be quite thorny or a needle in a haystack. Just using your intuition, your experience, and so forth. So I can relate to that. But nature always exacts a price, right? So you're good at this thing, at this this sort of rational problem solving or isolating things and so forth. But I wonder what price you pay for that. In my case, when I was younger, it was a narrowing of focus that I had to broaden again as I got a little older, right? And I wonder what price Kubrick paid as a human being.
Yeah. Well, I think he was a lonely man. There's a film, by the way, a documentary called Boxes, which I recommend. It's about his boxes. He has a huge archival collection of boxes of production materials from the beginning of his career till the end. And what you see is the paradox, of course, is like, on one level he's a problem solver and and a taskmaster and all that, but on another level he wasted a lot of time with his obsession with details. And so, for example, in Eyes Wide Shut, that's just one detail. Do you all remember the famous castle where the orgies take place?
Yeah.
So he has one box has like 100 pictures of the gate for that castle. So 100 types of gates that he can pick for a shot that appears for like maybe 5 minutes in the film. And so he asked people to go photograph all the gates in New York, and then they come with all these photos, and then he selects the one he thinks is the best one. That's why it takes forever to make a film, because that's just one. Seems like an insignificant detail, but the level of obsession and perfectionism is just like, drives everyone mad, and it's actually not efficient, but that's how his mind works.
Precisely. You have to be able to know, and this is one of the things that I learned in my career in technology. The idea is not to consider all options, but to consider the most probable option. And for a filmmaker, I imagine it's like it's not not I can't do everything, but what gets what gets the story moving. Robert. Oh, I'm sorry, Dennis. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, taking pictures of all those gates and taking so much time, that means that he had access to basically a limitless budget, it seems. And one thing about The Killing,
or free labor.
Well, yeah. Exactly. I mean, when we get to talking about Jim Thompson, I mean, the writers are on strike right now.
Yes, so, exactly.
Anyway, one thing that he said about The Killing, and he was talking about his producer partner, I think his name's Harris. He said, we wanted to show that you could make a good movie without a lot of money. So he did. I mean, they did. But then by the time you get to Eyes Wide Shut, I mean, I don't know how long it took him to make that movie. Or how long to, but he had obviously no worries about money and time.
Yes. And does anyone recall the studio that bankrolled that? Was it Paramount or Sony? I don't recall.
For this one, The Killing? Yeah, I think it was
for
United
Eyes Wide,
Artists.
Okay, that was UA.
But for Eyes Wide Shut, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but the budget was very large. Now, I want to turn the mic over to Dennis in a minute. But, Robert, before we do, one of the things that Charlie mentioned, and he'll be diving into that in some detail after Dennis speaks, is that the chessboard nature of the heist itself and the arrangement of the script, that there were moments when we then focus on, the romantic relationships. Or, well, one relationship that, of course, seemed to be kind of a mutual, how would I call it? Mutual fantasy, not mutual fantasy, because I forget the character's name, but the very famous film noir actress, she's using him, and of course she has her actual lover.
George and Sherry.
Yeah, you're talking about George and Sherry.
George and Sherry, thank you.
George and Sherry are vintage Jim Thompson.
Yes, and so there's that relationship, and then of course there's a relationship between Sterling Hayden and his love interest in the movie. How would you think about those interludes in relation to the structure of the film itself? Because for some, it takes you outside of the heist. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's what appeals to me about the non-linear structure, which could be the reason why it might not appeal to someone else. It might be confusing as well. It says something about how you represent the complexity of time, especially simultaneity of different characters doing different things at the same time, and how do you represent that visually in a film?
Yes.
Going back and forth in time, and you could do this by breaking down space, which is what Mike Figgis did in Time Code, by kind of what we're doing right now, splitting the screen into 4 so that you show simultaneity this way, or you don't do it spatially, but do it temporally by going back and forth in time. And so there's that appeals to me, because for me, the linear structure, which is what's most familiar, it's easy to follow, but in a sense it's boring to me. But this kind of structure is more challenging, more confusing, but it makes me want to watch the movie again. And so to me, that's a win. Now, of course, I see your point about how the development of relationships could be lost as a result, because you can lose some of those threads. So that could be one of the negative side effects of that kind of structure.
And also, I mean, and of course, this gets to the cliches of the era, like the way that the relationships are portrayed, because you have one woman who's like utterly devoted, of course, and she knows that her man is a criminal, but she doesn't care. She loves him no matter what, and and that, of course, is a trope of the era. And in film noir, but then of course we have the actual film noir lady,
right?
Who
femme fatale.
The femme fatale, like she really she does love, her lover, or at least she's sexually compelled.
There's
by
the
him.
sick wife as well. The sick
that's
wife,
right. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I think is an interesting subplot because it reminded me of a famous moral psychology dilemma, Heinz's dilemma. Right, the husband is motivated to commit a crime for a good cause, right?
Yes,
to save his wife who's sick. So
yeah.
There's another relationship that is sort of, you barely see it, but the guy who bankrolled the thing, the older guy.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Quite interesting.
He's obviously carrying a torch for the Sterling Hayden character.
Yes, the homoerotic elements are quite clear if you're able to discern them. Like when he says, "Let's you and me, let's just run away," and I'm like, "Oh, yeah. That's not the statement of a guy who just wants to bankroll a heist. That's a statement of a person who's in love."
Right. And after that, he gets really drunk and shows up at the racetrack.
Yeah,
true.
I don't think that was part of the plan.
Right.
By the way, I wanted to say Marie Windsor, who played Sherry.
Yes.
I found out the other day she's from Utah.
Oh.
She graduated from Brigham Young University and was a lifelong Mormon.
Was she? That's quite interesting.
Yeah, we found that out about Dorothy Malone.
Yes, that Dorothy Malone, who in the spirit of Ebert, who confessed to being sexually attracted to a character in a movie, and that coloring his feeling about the movie, which I appreciated his honesty. I had the same reaction to Dorothy Malone in Written on the Wind, because I just found her very attractive. So it's like, so whenever a character would appear, I'd be like, well, that's just a really beautiful woman. And so her performance is also quite good, but I also had that quite basic reaction to the actress's presentation on screen, rather than trying to pretend that wasn't occurring. But I wanted to move on. I wanted to move to were you saying something, Charles?
Not yet.
Oh, you're okay. Okay.
No. I knew you were going to go to Dennis first.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's flesh it all out before I make some possibly terrible criticisms.
They're not terrible. It's all good. Yeah. So Dennis, I know you've done quite a bit of research into Jim Thompson and to other aspects of the film. So I want to turn the floor over to you to dive into that.
I really like the chance to talk about Jim Thompson because I have been reading him for decades. And I sent you guys a note that said I discovered him in San Francisco about the same time I discovered J.G. Ballard.
Mm-hmm.
And I read both of them, sort of back and forth for pretty, I'll put it this way. I have them here. So Jim Thompson, he was born in 1906. He knocked around for decades, doing different things. He was born in Oklahoma. Well, actually, Indian Territory. He was born a year before statehood, and he lived in Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, and he didn't really make it until the 50s. When he got into a relationship with a publisher called Lion Books. And in the early 50s, he wrote, there were a few years he wrote 4 or 5 books a year. So over his lifetime, he wrote about 30 books, but most of them were written in the 50s. And I discovered them in a bookstore. When he died in 1977, his books have been out of print in the U.S. for years. They were still being published in France, although, they weren't huge, but they were still there. And he famously told his wife, make sure you keep all the copyrights in order because I'll be famous about 10 years after I die. And that's exactly what happened. Mm. So I discovered him at a bookstore in San Francisco on Haight Street, I believe it was. And can you see this?
Yes. Uh-huh.
So there was a publisher.
It's getting blurred out, but there you go.
There you go. So you can see the sort of lurid cover, right?
Yes.
And this is my favorite. This is called Pop 1280.
Yeah, look at that. Let me actually zoom that in for a minute. Let me give you. There you go.
Yeah. So Pop 1280. The pop refers to population, So it's a small town, and this little guy is the sheriff. And, excuse me, he is one of a few lawmen that were psychopaths. And that comes from Jim Thompson. Part of his knocking around, he worked in the oil fields in Texas. And he worked in the days when the derricks were made out of wood. And so one thing that you had to do was keep them nailed together all the time. So he had a job doing that. And one day it was hot, summertime, and he's up at the top of one of these derricks. And the deputy sheriff rolls up. And there's nothing else around. Nothing. It's in the middle of Texas, West Texas. And anyway, there's some kind of warrant because Thompson had worked in a hotel. And part of his job was to procure whatever guests wanted, including booze and drugs and women. And I just found out just yesterday that the hotel that he worked in was where John F. Kennedy spent his last night. It was in Fort Worth. Anyway, somewhere in his past, he had gotten a warrant. I don't know what for, but anyway, this guy's coming out to bring him in. And Thompson is young, and he's like, "Oh, I'll just stay here, until he leaves." And the guy just sits down and just sits. And then he goes and very slowly takes some water and starts talking about, "Yeah, it's really awful hot out here, isn't it?" And he's just fucking with him. And finally, he puts on a pair of gloves. And he says, "There's two ways we can do this." And so Thompson came down, of course. But he used that. He said that I always tried to figure that guy out. And when I finally thought I had him figured out, I wrote The Killer Inside Me, which was the book. This gets to Kubrick. Kubrick was crazy about The Killer Inside Me. In fact, every time you look at a Jim Thompson book now, you'll see this. Reading from Pop 1280. It's an intro by Barry Gifford. Director Stanley Kubrick wrote that Jim Thompson's novel, The Killer Inside Me, was, quote, probably the most chilling and believable first-person story of a criminally warped mind I have ever encountered, end quote. So Kubrick wanted Thompson for The Killing. So now we can get back to Kubrick being not a very nice guy sometimes. Jim Thompson, his fingerprints are all over this screenplay. Anybody who knows him can recognize. There's a conversation between George and Sherry, which I might read here in a minute. But anyway, so Jim Thompson was very excited. He thought, Hollywood, here I come. And then when he went to the premiere and the credits rolled, it said screenplay by Stanley Kubrick, additional dialogue by Jim Thompson. So that was the first of many times Jim Thompson got kicked in the teeth by Hollywood just over and over and over again. And you can say that it was partially his fault for two main reasons. One is that he never had an attorney. He was sort of foolishly thought of the old Texas, Oklahoma handshake, which was probably crap in Texas and Oklahoma as well, but certainly in Hollywood, Yeah. And the other was that he drank. And there's evidence that he signed a couple of things after he'd been drinking, which, his family believes in one instance in particular that they purposely got him drunk, which it was not hard to do. But it was people he thought were his friends. And anyway, he signed away rights to a book or something that might have been turned into a screenplay later. Anyway, but he kept working with Kubrick. He wrote Paths of Glory, for example.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they had an interesting relationship. Jim Thompson's family describes Kubrick at the time as like a beatnik. And then Jim Thompson was always, he might have a stain on his tie, but he always had a tie. You know what I mean? Anyway, I said earlier, George and Sherry are vintage Jim Thompson. So let me read this very short passage here from The Killing. You'll probably remember it, I'm sure. So George says, I got to go out tonight. I don't suppose there's anything for dinner. Sherry says, of course there is, darling. There's all sorts of things. And you remember her voice. Of course there is, darling. So There are all sorts of things. We have cake, asparagus, and potatoes. And George says, I don't smell nothing. And Sherry says, that figures because you're too far away from it. And George says, too far away from it. And Sherry says, certainly. You don't think I have it all cooked, do you? It's all down in the shopping center. Jim Thompson does men and women talking to each other like that over and over and over again. And it's, that's funny.
It is.
He's funny. And as I said earlier, the writers are on strike now, and I was looking at, you mentioned this, Dwayne, about how they are being smart talking about AI.
Yes.
So what they're worried about is streaming and just a wage floor, how AI is going to, they don't want it to creep in and take their jobs. And then there's something called writers' rooms. Apparently, Robert, this is a recurring theme with us, is talking about writers and how they get screwed in Hollywood. And the first episode or whatever we did, Dwayne brought up in response to something Charles said, turning writers into sweatshop workers. Mm-hmm. And apparently this writer's room situation is exactly that. A tiny little room where everybody's supposed to. I'm not describing it because I don't know exactly what it is, but I know I saw it. Anyway, long story short, seems like there was every once in a while, writers get a little love in Hollywood.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But it's pretty rare.
Yeah.
They are really
Capital always resents and seeks to belittle and dismantle the power of labor who have some degree of leeway based upon how much they're needed. And indeed, the entire purpose of automation in any form is to devalue labor. And that's why the use of generative text. And before all of this technology, there were other means of doing it, like in the era of Thompson. Whatever means you could come up with, the fact that the writer is desperate, the fact that they're young, the fact that they have some kind of issue of some sort, they come from a small town, they can't afford an attorney. So
that's why
the system.
Yeah, that's why you got a guy like Thompson.
Yeah. Well, and today, what they're doing is, because people are savvier, now they're simply just trying to deploy automation directly, because of course there's a greater degree of knowledge available, to writers, and they're more organized than they were in the mid to late 20th century, certainly the mid 20th century.
Yeah, another thing you said, Dwayne, was that writers want to write.
Yes.
So they're desperate to. In Thompson's case, for example, he was desperate for money all the time. That's why you get a guy that'll write 5 books in a year, because, if you just let him go, he'll do it, But, he never had any money.
Yeah.
And then I was reading the other day about Billy Wilder, who always thought of himself as like a screenwriter rather than a director. Mm-hmm. And, you don't get that so often either, where a person can sort of have total control over a movie.
Yeah.
Every once in a while. But anyway, the late night talk shows, Jimmy Kimmel and all those guys, they're already off the air. They can't do anything because they write up until the moment that they're going to, tape the show. There's no way they can continue without writers. But another thing I was reading was that people might not. They went on strike, I think, about 7 years ago. And it was pretty noticeable to everyone that it was going on.
Yeah.
But this time, because of streaming and because of being able to get access to things, and binge watch and all that stuff, one thing I read said that people are not going to notice it as much unless they're Jimmy Kimmel fans.
We'll see how that plays out. As I said, this is the latest manifestation, and it's good that you brought up Thompson's career and his struggles, because it does tie directly into current concerns, and it also shows that regardless of the fact that we have all these shiny gadgets and what have you. Things have not really changed all that much. And in fact, the gadgets are only deployed to continue, what was happening in the past.
That's about it for me. I could keep going, but I think one thing, and I have to find. I only just found out about this, but Orson Welles was a fan, and there were talks. You know how they always talk about in talks of Orson Welles doing a movie with a Jim Thompson screenplay. That would have been great.
I could see that being fantastic. Yeah, if they had managed to work together, collaborate effectively, because Thompson's sense and his style, I think, would have lent itself to Welles's view and vision quite nicely, actually, especially on a noir. But now I want to turn the mic over to R.C. Charles Roberts to get his view of the film and his critique of the film and your ideas of the film.
Well, as Dwayne knows, because I was talking to him about it, I watched this movie last night / this morning during a bout of insomnia. And about 40 minutes into it, I stepped away for a little bit and watched some W.C. Fields videos because, how do I put this? So the movie for me was a little, trying to think of the right word. It's a bit of a mixed bag. We'll put it that way. We'll start there. The beginning of it I thought was actually fairly interesting because it's a very interesting display of group dynamics. The idea of bringing people together, kind of planning out how everybody is supposed to interact for a particular project and things like that. Made me think of the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion, because he did a lot of work on group dynamics. And it was fairly interesting. However, one criticism I have, and this is a personal criticism, it doesn't affect the value of the movie. And I actually kind of want to emphasize the difference between a personal criticism as a moviegoer and actual criticism, which is,
yeah, like for example, the second Transformers movie is horrible. It's just flat out terrible. And however, so you can have a criticism of it as a film itself, but you can also have a personal reaction to it.
Well, I wrote an article about this recently here, but the way we do criticism nowadays, or so it seems to me, it's very much a sort of a debunking, personal taste-centric kind of approach, where if somebody doesn't like a film because they either don't understand it or it's a little disconcerting to their experience, they consider it terrible. And then they go after it and, I had to get a dictionary because my vocabulary is shot. And so I don't like the movie. Or, nonsense, like that. I'm exaggerating. But nonetheless, on a personal level, I didn't quite care for the voiceover. I understand why it was used in a cinematic sense. I get it. It was a little odd for me. It kind of felt like, I'll put it this way, the immersion into the movie for me, whenever there was the voiceover, it kind of took me out of the immersion just a little bit. And I know this is one of his first mature movies, so, but that was one thing. Another thing, though, that Dwayne brought up earlier was the relationship between George and Sherry. I didn't have a problem necessarily with the dynamic itself. It was actually fairly funny to me. I did find George kind of comically pathetic, and it was interesting to see that play out in a movie about a heist, because most movies about heists nowadays, everyone's an expert in something.
That's a good point.
But this was more of a I don't want to say small town, but it was more like a local heist, it seemed. And they were picking up people who were useful, even if as a person like George, they're fairly ridiculous. I mean, he got slapped around immediately, it seems. First by his wife and then by the rest of the crew. So I found that fairly comical. But as Dwayne was mentioning before, the group dynamics were set up very well in the beginning. And then I felt like as it moved out to explore kind of the relationships that make up the group dynamic, that it kind of felt like it got lost a little bit. Now, that might just be me, because I am terrible at paying attention to things, so it might be my fault. But like you get to George and Sherry, and I'm just going to use that as one example because I think it works in everything. I'm also using them because they seem to be kind of the main relationship that's focused on, mostly because there's the betrayal.
Yeah.
But it seemed to kind of take away from the heist in the sense that I went from being, focused on the heist and how that's going to work out and everything like that to kind of being focused on the drama in that relationship, which, again, it's kind of a personal thing.
Well, I think I'm going to just
go ahead.
I think what you're talking about may be sort of.
Unfortunately, I'm bumbling through it. Yes.
Well, it may be tension between what we talked about earlier with Kubrick and a kind of perfectionism and technical stuff, and Jim Thompson with George and Sherry. Maybe he didn't really get to go to town with George and Sherry,
Right.
In a typical Thompson novel, George would be the protagonist because that's the kind of guy he wrote about, And they go crazy, and they kill somebody, and you're inside their head all the time.
Right.
So,
right.
That's hard to do in a movie.
That's actually a good way to put it. Was it felt like there was a little bit of a conflict between focusing on George and Sherry as the relationship, and then the overall group dynamics that were kind of the focus of the heist, everybody doing their jobs, or in the case of the older fellow not doing what they were told. But it seemed like a kind of tension that I wasn't able exactly to appreciate, maybe, or work through. But when I told Dwayne that I'd stepped away to watch some W.C. Fields videos, he told me that if you keep watching it, the end, brings it all together. Which I did, and Dwayne was correct about that. It does bring it all together. I actually think after that 40 minutes, and I think, what is it, like an hour and a half long movie? I think after that 40 minutes was definitely the better part of the movie. As far as any sort of objective cinematic criticisms, I thought it was interesting. It felt experimental to me as a movie.
Interesting.
Which maybe was the point, maybe wasn't the point. I don't know.
I think experimental might be a good word. A lot of people talk about it and how it influenced them.
That's quite interesting.
Quentin Tarantino was crazy about this movie. And then if you look at Pulp Fiction, there's similar elements of, you're with one character and then you move to another.
Yeah, as Robert was mentioning at the beginning,
I actually really enjoyed that. I enjoyed how non-linear it was. The only objective criticism I think I'd have is that the non-linear aspect seemed a little disjointed. And again, that might just be my perspective. But that's the only thing I could think of. The dialogue was fairly interesting. The way it was set up and everything, the way everything works out, and the tempo of the movie was interesting. But again, that tension kind of plays through for me on the whole thing, because you've got the tempo of the main guy, Johnny, and then everybody has their own kind of tempo, which is fine, and that's actually appreciated. It just didn't seem to meld together quite as well for me.
And I that didn't bother me because it reminded me in a cinematic way of life. In other words, obviously, there's never any situation in which a group of people are really all in sync.
Right.
But one of the things I wanted to build on from what you just said, Charlie, is that, and Dennis, you mentioned this about Thompson's characters, and Robert, I'd like to get your thoughts on this too, of course. Today, with heist movies, as Charlie mentioned, everyone is super competent. There's the guy who's the computer guy. There's the explosives guy. There's the this guy. There's the that guy or woman. And everyone, but it's typically men, of course. But everyone is extraordinarily competent. And this seems to be one of the conceits of the modern era of the 21st century, is that there's no room in cinematic presentation for a George. But there was room for that kind of character in the 1950s and 60s. For individuals who we might call pathetic or what have you, but really they're just people. Yeah, exactly. Right. But
can we speak about George's eyes, because that's a big feature of his acting, right? Like the way he stares and the lighting reflecting on his eyes. And
like when he's standing on the stairs and he watches who was it, Johnny, go up the stairs, and he's just. And of course, I've never seen anybody admire stairs. So.
If you saw a couple like George and Sherry, my first thought would be, well, what is she doing with him, right? I mean,
who has the money or who got pregnant?
Exactly, like what because and this is unfair, perhaps, but not just his looks, but just his aura. But I'm curious about why anybody thinks that fell away. Like, why is there no tolerance in modern movies, at least in movies about this kind of topic, for anybody who has any kind of issues? People can make a mistake, but there don't seem to be there's no one who isn't cool. I think that's the way that I would put it.
Right, and there's no one who has those crazy eyes.
No, not at all.
You can't look like that anymore.
No, you can't.
You can't look like what's the other guy with the teeth? Tim Carey. Is that his name? Carey?
Absolutely.
No,
you can't look like that. And Charles, I wanted to say, when he's looking up the stairs, you talked about he's admiring Johnny, but he's also, if you remember, that's after Sherry told him that Johnny had tried to. She suggested Johnny did something.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
So she knows exactly. She knows exactly how to play George.
How to play George, right?
Yeah, she's a piano player.
Yes, exactly.
Well, and this gets to something. When we were just getting started with this, Dwayne was asking for people, to talk about themes or whatever, and Charles said he wanted to talk about, insecurity, male insecurity.
Yes.
And he was talking specifically, I think you were talking about the 70s or something, but
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the more you look, it's forever,
Yes, it is, right? And Sterling Hayden's character Johnny, I mean, you picture him, and I believe his character was supposed to have been this, as like a field commander in World War II. Right.
Yeah, we talked about that with Ray Milland and Panic in Year Zero.
Yes, precisely. Like the kind of person who had been in combat in the Pacific or in Europe, and okay, that's in the past. But then something happens, and these instincts, this training, this ability to take command of a situation is still there, even though the war was 10, 15 years in the past. Doesn't matter. And so he has that capability. In his repertoire of abilities. And then there's a person like George, and you think, well, what was George doing during the war? And for that generation of people, World War II, of course, was the anchor point for who you were, right, as a person. And perhaps that's the difference with the modern era, is that, the wars that occurred after that were, of course, defeats for the United States. And so you can't, you can't say, I mean, you can protect, the lone warrior, muscle-bound guy who's running around in Colorado, killing the mob or something, while his beautiful blonde wife waits at home, looking sexy or something and worried. We have that, but we don't have, we don't have a group dynamic, like a group leader in that sense. And also, as I said, we don't have people who are free to be weird.
Yes.
As we defined it. And I'm curious about if anybody's thoughts about exactly, and Robert, you as a scholar of psychology and as a researcher, what might have changed in the culture to bring about this about?
Well, if I can jump in just for a second, you can't be weird in America anymore. And like you know, I think I mentioned George Burns one time. He said, "There's no place to be bad." He was talking about developing his comedy skills. Well, I mean, Austin's motto is "Keep Austin weird," and people are worried that you can't be weird in America.
Yeah,
I mean, I think there's because there's no place to be weird. I just wanted to throw that in. So go ahead, Robert. I'm sorry.
I mean, there's you had political correctness in the 90s, and now we have what we call cancel culture. I mean, that's a whole other conversation.
Yes.
But a couple of things I want to mention because I know we're almost running out of time. One, because we talked about the writer's strike, which of course we all support here. Yes. It's interesting to think about Trumbo as well. The screenwriter that worked with Kubrick on Spartacus, Kirk Douglas supporting him. He was blacklisted as a communist, but still he was able to change his name and write Spartacus. And of course, Spartacus is one of the best radical films of Hollywood. And then, so that's interesting connection with Kubrick there. And then I wanted to talk briefly about the cinematography. I mean, I don't want to mention the obvious things that we expect from film noir, but something that's very much like part of Kubrick's style that I really admire in his use of lighting. And so he loves to use lighting as part of the mise en scène, particularly table lamps and ceiling lamps. So you've seen this in the films. He tries to make it look as natural as possible, that the lighting of the film comes from within the film itself, and you can see the source of the lighting. This technique is developed in this film, and you can see it all the way to Eyes Wide Shut. I mean, the famous party opening scene, all that lighting is done with light bulbs that are very powerful throughout the party. And that way it allows him to move the camera without doing a setup each time differently for the lighting. Now, of course, Barry Lyndon is another great example because he used candle light to really capture the era. Yeah, and so he had to change the exposure on the camera, open it more, longer lasting, so that he can use candle light and actually film. So that's something that he's really. This is where his obsession actually results in something very interesting aesthetically. So that's, I think, an interesting feature to think about.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's I plan on. I mean, I do tend to watch these movies several times. To catch things that I miss. And in the case of Written on the Wind, to see Dorothy Malone again. And I do plan on watching The Killing many times. And it's interesting that you mentioned Spartacus, which is another movie I think we need to do. And Robert, at some point in the future, I would love to have you back on to talk about that. Spartacus is one of my favorite movies. And it's interesting because it was one of my favorites as a kid because, of course, sword and sandals, right? The whole Roman thing. And as a child, I focused on, the glory of Rome as Laurence Olivier's character. What was it? There's a moment in which he says, if Rome didn't exist, I'd have to dream her. And it's hilarious. And also probably true moment for, say, he plays Crassus. Yes, he plays Crassus in the movie. But as I got older, and my understanding of the world matured, it was, of course, the slaves that I focused on entirely, and I saw Rome as being the monstrous organization that it was, actually. But that is a conversation for another time. Any closing thoughts, gentlemen, before we...
I may ask a question for you guys. What did you all think of the closing shot of the detectives coming out of the airport doors and the music?
Oh, yeah.
Well, one thought I had about that was when you're watching a movie, you have a tendency to look at, why did he get such a big suitcase? Why did he do this? Why did he do that?
Right.
And of course, the answer is always, it's a movie and you needed an ending, and that's a great ending. The money is just blowing all over the place. And
yeah, we love Hitchcock on these questions, right? He said, yeah, it's a movie.
Yeah, he always talked down about the plausibilists, and then Tippi Hedren, when she goes upstairs in The Birds, she gets attacked in that room upstairs. Anyway, they're making the movie, and she says, "Why am I going up there?" And Hitchcock, "Because I tell you to,"
Right.
And I like Hitchcock, but the way he treated actors was
yes, of course,
shitty.
Yes, of course.
Right.
This is the challenge of artists and our correct, not politically correct, but actually correct moral sense. For me, I love that ending, and the reason I loved it is that it was tragic and ridiculous at the same time, right? And it was like, it was almost. I almost expected like the Three Stooges to show up, right? Or Harpo to start playing on his, on his cello or something, like as the money's blowing away, because it is completely absurd and yet but also tragic, but also in a bizarre cinematic way plausible. Like, well, of course, how could you possibly have gotten away with this?
Well, yeah,
right?
And the tragedy is expressed clearly by Sterling Hayden. He says something like, "What's the difference?" Or
all right, run away is like, what's the difference?
Yeah, what's the difference? Yeah. Which is probably one of the most noir things you could possibly say in a film, right? Like, okay, whatever.
Well, speaking of endings and Jim Thompson, I can circle back here because when he was alive, there was a movie made of a book called The Getaway. And it starred Steve McQueen and Ali MacGraw. Yes,
I've seen it.
Yeah. So that was a Jim Thompson book. And he wrote a screenplay. Steve McQueen didn't like it. So, Sam Peckinpah directed it. And Sam Peckinpah is not a bright, sunshiny guy. But they changed the ending of the book completely because it was just so dark. And that's another way that Thompson in that sense, your work is essentially taken away from you.
Yeah.
You're like, I wrote this thing, and then you're going to take it. Sam Fuller wanted to make a movie of that book. That would have been much better.
Yes, absolutely. So Fuller production of that would have been probably remarkable. But before we close, Charles, let's hear your thoughts on the ending of the film.
So, the ending actually kind of, let's say, it kind of symbolizes what I actually like about the overall, which you kind of watch the heist be undone by its own people. It's not, they're not, they get caught, and it's not because, how they do crime shows now where the police are really good, or, they're, even the betrayal isn't really what undoes them. What it is it's everybody who did their part did it, except not quite what it's supposed to be. And so when he says, what's the difference? It's kind of an interesting sort of indifference where he just realizes that everything they did ultimately undermined their project, which actually to me is quite Sartrean. Although, while we're talking about writers, and I'm glad they're on strike, first off, because I always think of Gore Vidal's disdain for the film auteur, which he used to say with a sneer. But Gore Vidal had a similar issue in two different ways. One, he'd write a script and they would, doctor it up, change it a bunch, and then they'd slap his name on there when he was more famous.
That's
They'd be like,
worse.
like Caligula. They put Gore Vidal's Caligula, and he had to get, litigation done to have it removed. But also it's in the other way, which he talks about in some of his essays, where, you were there working, a whole bunch, and then they basically just kind of, they're like, oh, hey, thanks for the script. Okay. So I hope the writers really stick it to them. They should. They should, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough road, but their work is as important as any other, and any victory on the labor front is worth supporting.
Right. And they shouldn't allow for automation or whatever.
And also because, and I'll leave everyone with this. It is guaranteed that the studios will try. They're already trying to use what is called generative AI to produce scripts. And the way that they will try to do this is by making the scripts as templatable as possible. And Netflix has already paved the way for this by making like these really just very silly movies. Recently, my wife and I watched a movie with the guy who played Captain America. I forget his name.
Chris Evans.
Yes, Chris Evans. And I think Chris Evans is a finer actor than he's been given an opportunity to be. Like you get a sense that he's actually like a real actor, but he's living in an era in which he cannot be the actor that he could be. There are certain actors in which you watch them work, you watch how they move on film, and you're like, in a different time, in a different world, you would be probably a fantastic artist.
It's like his performance in Knives Out. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. But
he got stuck in contracts, right? He has to like do a number of films for the studios, and so
that's right. It's exactly right. But the kinds of movies that people are compelled to do, in which the assassin comes out of retirement, and they're running around Pakistan, Paris, and blah blah blah. I mean, you could do that script in your sleep, and so they could churn out this kind of thing over and over and over again via template until people just stop viewing.
Oh yeah.
And I guarantee you that this is what the streamers, the tech companies, and what remains of the major studios are probably planning to do. But that is a topic for another time. Don't get me started on that.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time and for your contributions. I think this was a great conversation. Robert, thank you so much for bringing your insights to our show. And everyone, I hope that you enjoyed, and please join us the next time. As they say, like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And au revoir, everyone.
Support for the writers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Solidarity with the writers.
Absolutely. Ciao, everyone.
Bye-bye.